this Russia stuff going on. I mean, I could not think of a better time to have you on the show, because we're not only marking the 60th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis, we're in the middle of that 13 days right now. We also find ourselves on the brink of nuclear Armageddon, according to the president anyway, right here, right now, October 2022. There are so many parallels between then and now. I'm sure you see them too, so we'll get into that. And I just want to start by taking us all back in time, 61 years, a year before the missile crisis, just to kind of set the stage. It's the height of the Cold War. John F. Kennedy is the newly elected 35th president of the United States. And nuclear tensions with the Soviet Union are extremely high. How high, you ask? Well, this high. Let me play you a video here of just how high those Cold War tensions were. This is President Kennedy a year before the missile crisis, speaking about a national nuclear alert that the whole country was taking part in.
Ladies and gentlemen, a message from the President of the United States.
Fellow Americans, the annual civil defense exercise, of which this broadcast is a part, is a test of our program of peaceful preparedness. We do not expect war. However, common prudence demands that we take all necessary measures to protect our homes, our institutions, and our way of life. Should the United States ever be subjected to direct enemy attack, CONELRAD and the National Emergency Broadcasting System will be vital to our defense. This carefully planned program would prevent an enemy from using our radio stations to assist him, and yet permits emergency broadcasting such as you now hear. The voluntary participation of the radio and television broadcasters of the nation at their own expense is a commendable example of individual responsibility, which is so essential to the survival of this nation. Government, too, must fulfill its responsibility in civil defense with vigorous leadership. It is also true, however, that individual preparedness, which is beyond the province of government, is essential to an effective civil defense. The most ambitious and carefully organized activities of government will prove inadequate. We are a people of strong faith in ourselves and in our institutions. We believe that our freedom and our liberty are worth protecting. Therefore, I ask you to support civil emergency planning in your local communities. To those participating in this three-day exercise, I express my appreciation for your active response to the obligations of citizenship in a free country.
You have just heard the President of the United States, John F. Kennedy.
So you'd have to be pretty old to remember that. You'd have to be over the age of 60.
Are you trying to needle me, Lori?
I wasn't going to mention your age because you look so much younger than you really are, but I'll just
thanks.
Am I wrong? Would I be wrong to ask if you are old enough to remember those civil defense drills?
I do. I remember jumping under my desk during the so-called civil defense exercises. Okay,
do you remember,
which is so stupid, when you really think about it today. What were those people thinking of? I believe that this address was as a result of Vienna and the Berlin crisis.
It was shortly after that, I believe. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. And Kennedy, first of all, Kennedy should have never agreed to meet Khrushchev in 1961.
I agree.
Okay. Because he was coming off this disaster at the Bay of Pigs, all right, and which everybody misinterpreted, what the result of that really was, that the CIA really wanted him to invade Cuba, and he's the one who didn't. Alan Dulles wrote about this later, that he fully expected Kennedy to intervene once he saw the invasion was failing. Well, Kennedy didn't do it, okay, and he chose a defeat, rather than have an American superpower invade a third world country.
Yeah, without any provocation. I mean, Cuba
Right,
gave us no
right.
reason to invade them, and yet
Yes.
this full-scale invasion of Cuba was planned by the CIA, and that's the setup for what led to the missile crisis.
See,
So,
in Vienna, Kennedy was very surprised that Khrushchev was so belligerent during the crisis. He kept on pushing this idea of Berlin being really a part of East Germany, West Berlin being a part of East Germany, you know. And see, this was one of the points. See, Kennedy, he couldn't see, what are we doing why do you want to send combat troops into this Indochina, which is 9,000 miles away? He couldn't see the sense in that. All right, but Berlin was different because Kennedy saw West Berlin as the keystone to the Atlantic Alliance. And he thought, if I give up West Berlin, how are the NATO allies going to think we're going to stand by them if I give up West Berlin? So this was a real sticking point that he refused to give in on, And so when Khrushchev kept haranguing him during those days in Vienna, the Vienna conference, Kennedy came back and he was very disturbed because he thought that, I think that these guys are really serious. They're going to make a play for West Berlin. And so that's what provoked this speech, plus this calling up the reserves. This resulted, of course, as most people know, the whole showdown at the Berlin Wall, okay, in which because what happened there was Lucius Clay, the commander in West Berlin, and Bruce Clark, who I think was part of NATO, they were spoiling for a fight over the Berlin Wall, which
sound familiar in 2022?
See, and
NATO pushing the boundaries, right?
And see, Kennedy said, look, I'd rather have a wall than a war. I don't like having the wall, but what's the alternative? Okay, they're building it, all right, to stop their own emigration from coming over, all right? And so, but they really wanted to disturb things. And by the way, Clay actually took out tanks, set up as bulldozers in the woods to see if they could, and Kennedy's, he hears about this is nice.
He was furious, wasn't he?
Yeah. Okay. And so what he did there was something he was going to repeat in the missile crisis, is he had his brother intervene, okay, to conduct the negotiations. All right.
Oh, wait, I don't want to, we're getting too far ahead of ourselves.
No, I'm not going to talk about the missile crisis.
Okay, we're not there quite yet. Go ahead.
And so they made an agreement that if the Russians pulled back, 20 minutes later, Kennedy would pull back. Okay. And so, those guys were watching their watches, and 20 minutes later, Kennedy did pull back, from I think that's called the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin.
That's right.
All right. And so
they had tanks on either side. They had Soviet tanks on one side and American tanks on the other. And it was this big showdown, and it was who's going to blink first. So it was kind of the prelude to the missile crisis.
Right. Right. And by the way, the fact that, I don't have to tell you this, you guys probably know, but the fact that Kennedy relied on his brother in this one is going to be a forerunner that Robert Kennedy is really going to be like the diplomat at large, up until 1963. Okay, then because in 1961, following this, when everybody's trying to push JFK into bringing combat troops into Vietnam, okay, that it was. Should I tell this story?
Yeah,
it's an interesting story.
Absolutely.
See, the Joint Chiefs and many of the advisors, including Dean Rusk, the Secretary of State, and even Robert McNamara, Secretary of Defense, wanted to go into Vietnam, okay, in the fall of 1961.
Yeah, so did Vice President Johnson.
Yes.
Yeah.
And John Kenneth Galbraith was the ambassador to India, and he happened to be in town on that weekend, okay? And so he hears about this so-called Rostow-Taylor report recommending 8,000 combat troops into Vietnam. So he walks over to Rostow's office, And he says, Walt, I want to see this report you wrote. And Walt says, no, you can't see it, John. It's top secret. So a call came in. He turned around. Galbraith stole the report off his desk. All right. He walks it over to his hotel room and he reads it. And he calls up Kennedy. And he's horrified. He says, you're not really going to do this, are you? And Kennedy goes, write me up.
What?
Put the combat troops into Vietnam. Okay. You know, and Kennedy says, write me up a memo to counter it. So while he's writing the memo, Kennedy postpones the showdown meeting. When the memo comes in, he shows it to his brother. Okay. And they go over it. Then at the meeting, whenever somebody like Rusk would suggest inserting combat troops, Bobby Kennedy would step forward, and you can just imagine him with his arms folded in front of his chest. Okay. And he'd say, there will be no combat troops in Vietnam. All right. And that was a line that JFK drew in the sand, okay, which he was never going to retreat from.
Right.
Okay. All right. And which Johnson, well, we know what happened.
Yeah, well, we know what he did.
Right. All right.
Well, that brings us to October 1962, 60 years ago this month, and those 13 days that shocked the world. Let's just kind of start with day one of the crisis, and we'll just kind of take it day by day. What we're going to do is we're going to play you actual sound recordings, tapes, secretly recorded by President Kennedy inside the White House during the crisis.
Actually, you know what? Maybe we could do this before we get to the clip. Jim, I think your microphone is not selected. We're getting the camera microphone instead of the microphone on your headphone. So I'll run a little brief promo, and that'll give you an opportunity. If you look on the bottom, you'll see settings. Go in there on your StreamYard window, and then just select the microphone for your headphone instead of your camera mic. Hopefully that's what it is, but you're off mic. So,
I noticed that. Yeah, it sounded a little boomy.
So let's take a little break. I'll give you a moment to reconfigure there, and then we can come back, and that might just be better for the viewers. Is that okay if we do that?
Yeah, fine.
All right, we'll be back in about 60 seconds, folks. Stay.
Okay,
with us.
so
We'll be right back.
Fighting the Great Reset by leading the Great Resistance. Maverick News. The antivirus programs for your mind.
The New World Order. Government overreach. The Great Reset. Mainstream media lies. Now more than ever, independent voices are needed. Donate now at freedomreporters.com. That's freedomreporters.com. Maverick News. The antivirus program for your mind.
Okay, we're back. Hopefully that maybe made it
That better?
way better.
Much.
Fine.
Yeah.
Yeah, now we're much better. And one other thing, if maybe we can just get you to shuffle over to the side a little bit. You're kind of just
Which side? To my right?
yes. Yeah.
Okay, you want to center me?
Yeah.
Okay.
There you
Love
go.
the shades, bro.
All
That's great.
these-
Did you wear your special headphones for me
Yeah,
today?
I
The ones
did.
with all
I
the
did, yeah.
twinkly lights.
Yeah, they do sparkle.
You know how I love those, Jim.
Okay, we're in better shape now on the production side.
Are we gonna start? Is this the XCOM committee meeting?
Yeah,
the
I want to
first
play
one?
some XCOM community
Oh, okay,
tape.
fine.
You know, it's important to remember as you listen to this that nobody in the room is aware that they're being recorded. President
Except
Kennedy is
JFK.
doing this secretly, and
Yeah.
before we play those,
Oh, by the way, let me. I'm really glad you brought that up. Do you
yes,
know
I
why,
wanted to ask you about that.
Do you know why he did that?
That's what I'd like to ask.
This is why he did it. he was shocked after the Bay of Pigs when everybody deserted him. Okay. And they said, no, we never wanted to. And he said, I couldn't believe it. These guys, every single one of them, 21 in all recommended that we go in at the Bay of Pigs. Now they're saying somehow that I did this against their advice. Okay. And so that's why he did this time around. All right. So everybody could be on the record. And if anybody tried to
forever.
Deny, well, here you go, buddy. Is you talking about it right there? Okay.
Yeah. Jack had that eye on history. He was a student of history himself. He knew that everything that was being recorded would be used. Well, I think he intended to use it for when he wrote his memoirs later.
Yes,
He wanted to have a transcript, a record, a tape, but also to keep him honest. You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
So there's somebody came back later and said, "Oh, we didn't tell Kennedy to invade Cuba."
Right.
Oh, yes, you sure as hell did.
And by the way, these tapes are absolutely invaluable. And there's a book called The Kennedy Tapes, which has the written transcripts of them. And I've referred to it. Man,
it's a Bible. Yeah,
it's an incredible compendium of what happened during those 13 days. Yeah.
Yes. And, sometimes the audio isn't so clear because Kennedy had the microphones hidden. He had them taped, I think, under the conference table.
Yeah.
So they're in this big, boomy conference room and the sound isn't always so good. So there are some subtitles that are helpful. As you listen to these tapes, it'll tell you what's actually being said. And I trust these are accurate. They came from the National Archives and the JFK Presidential Library. So I think they would have an accurate transcript of every word that's being said. And it's so important that we hear every word. So I'm going to play a few minutes of this and we'll just listen to what happened from the very beginning of the Cuban Missile Crisis, day 1, October 16th, 1962.
This is a result of the photography taken somewhere, sir. There's a medium-range ballistic missile launch site and 2 new military encampments. The launch site of one of the encampments contains a total of at least 14 canvas-covered missile trailers, measuring 67 feet in length, 9 feet in width.
How do you know this is a medium-range ballistic missile?
The length, sir.
The what?
The length, yes.
The length of the missile, which part?
Mr. Graybill, our missile man, has some pictures of the equivalent Soviet equipment that has been dragged through the streets of Moscow that can give you some details.
Question, we have the photography of the nose itself. The nose cone is not on that missile. It measures 67 feet. The nose cone will be 4 to 5 feet longer, sir. And with this extra length, we could have missiles that have a range of 1,100 miles. It's ready to be fired. No, sir. What is the advantage? There must be some major reason for the Russians to set this up.
Well, maybe Mr. Khrushchev may have in mind there that he knows that we have a substantial nuclear superiority, but he also knows that we don't really live under fear of his nuclear weapons to the extent that he has to live under fear of ours. So we have weapons nearby in Turkey and places like that.
How many weapons do we have in Turkey?
About 15, I believe. When you carry a comment on the decision of nuclear warheads,
Sir, we've looked very hard. We can find nothing that would spell nuclear warhead in terms of any isolated area or unique security in this particular area. Making the nuclear warhead to the missile, it would take about a couple of hours to do that. We do not think they're any fire. The first and most important item I would seek to call to your attention is a new area, hitherto never seen by us, some 21 miles to the southwest of Havana. The last time we went over this area, the ground had just scarcely started to be scratched. It never identified irrevocably the signature of the Soviet intermediate range ballistic missile, which is estimatedly a 2,000-mile missile. But the elongation of the path and the location of the control bunker has suggested to our hearts, if not our minds, the kind of thing that might accompany an IRBM.
There's the IRBM you really put in fact degree that I look at. The decision of an island might be a forward base of major importance to Soviet. I think you have to think of the effect on the Soviets to do that. They would consider it a major back down and that this would free their hands for almost any kind of adventure they might want to try on in other parts of the world. If there is a strike without a preliminary discussion with Khrushchev, how many Soviet citizens would we kill? I don't know. It would be several hundred. Absolutely no. Kill is kill. Absolutely. We're using napalm, 750-pound bombs. This is an extensive strike we're talking about. It is. Having killed several hundred Soviet citizens, what kind of response does Khrushchev have over to it? It seems to me that it just must be a strong response. And I think we should expect that. And therefore the question really is, are we willing to pay some kind of a rather substantial price to eliminate these missiles? I think the price is going to be high.
A course of action where we strike without warning is like Pearl Harbor. It's the kind of conduct that one might expect of the Soviet Union. It is not conduct that one expects of the United States. Well, let me ask, is there anyone here that doesn't think we ought to do something about it? During the course of the day, opinions had obviously switched from the advantages of a first strike on the missile site and on Cuban aviation to a blockade. The consensus was that we should go ahead with the blockade beginning on Sunday night. Originally, we should begin by blockading Soviet against the shipment of additional offensive capacity. Tighten the blockade as the situation required. I was most anxious that we not have to announce a state of war existing, because it would obviously be bad to have the word go out that we were having a war rather than with a limited blockade for a limited purpose.
So we'll pause that there. And something I should point out is that these tapes were not actually declassified until some 30 years after the crisis. The public didn't get to hear these until when? Jim, when were they declassified?
And I think it was the 90s.
Yeah, it was the 90s sometime.
Yeah, it was when these two guys went in and listened to them and put together a transcription. And, you know, once they did that, then they went ahead and let everything go. You know, and by the way, I should add that prior to that, you know, what you had was what most historians are forced to work with, which is the memoir, you know, what somebody writes about what happened instead of what actually really did happen, you know. And this beginning here of the crisis, I think this goes through the first 3 days. Mm-hmm. What's really striking when you read the full transcript is that how many people wanted to just go, and like, I think it was George Ball, who said, well, wouldn't that be like Pearl Harbor if we just went in without any warning and just started bombing things? You know, and then McNamara says, well, how many civilians are we going to kill? Yeah, and he says, well, we're going to use napalm, so it's going to be a lot of people, And
Right.
Kennedy, by the way, if you read the transcript, he presses these guys on that. He goes, realistically, how many people are going to get killed if we go ahead and bomb the silos? And first they started out a very low number. Kennedy doesn't believe it. He goes to Max Taylor, who's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and it jumped from the hundreds to the thousands. Okay.
Yeah.
And so you can just see Kennedy mentally, okay, forget it. We're not doing that.
Right.
Okay. Because there were 45,000 Russians in Cuba.
Already in
around,
Cuba.
yeah,
right. And they
right.
brought them in under the guise of being tourists, right?
Right.
They brought them in on a ship in street clothes, and they were just blending in, but they were ready to be activated at any
Right.
time. 42,000, was it 42 or 45,000?
It was my information was 45.
It was a
Okay.
lot.
Yes. So they had literally all these battalions of Russian troops there. And so, and Kennedy was very worried. Wait a minute.
And he didn't know.
You guys are going to call this a surgical strike, and then you're talking about killing thousands of civilians,
Yeah.
And so he later said to John Kenneth Galbraith, okay, when it was all over, he confided in him and he said, I was never going to do that surgical strike option. Never. Okay. And then, but the other alternative was worse. The other alternative these guys come up with is a vast air armada over Cuba, coupled with a land invasion. All right. Because Kennedy had started moving troops into Florida. Okay.
A sizable land invasion. I mean, I heard it was going to be some 250,000 Americans.
Well, the number I got was 150,000 troops that he brought into Florida. So that was the other option, and Kennedy is kind of, he's kind of recording. So I think it was McNamara who first brought up the blockade idea. All right. And Kennedy really liked that one. Okay. Because this was a way, okay, very few, if any, casualties. Plus, we can give the Russians time to think about this whole thing. All right. And so we can maybe negotiate, a way out of this. See, this was, if you look at the background, the reason Kennedy is upset is because he had made it clear to the Khrushchev, look, if you want to put defensive missiles in Cuba, that's one thing. Okay. But there should be no offensive weapons in Cuba. And he said this once in 1961 and about 6 weeks before the crisis in September of 1962. He said there should be no offensive weapons in Cuba. The last thing he wanted was for Cuba to be a staging ground for an attack on the United States. All right. And so he was shocked when these things, you can almost feel it in the way he's talking there, that Khrushchev would defy him like this. All right. And so what he began to think about, okay, from the very beginning, is that we have to get a negotiation on this thing. All right. And, we'll do it at any cost that we can afford, short of them keeping pumping. But here's something that's really kind of surprising. And it didn't come out till 1992. Everybody on the American side thought that the blockade had delayed any more missiles going to Cuba. All right. And in fact, I think Adlai Stevenson, when the Russians hit the blockade, it was either him or Dean Rusk said, I think we went eyeball to eyeball and the other guy just blinked. That's not true. That isn't true at all. In 1992 in Havana, the Russian commander from Moscow was there, and McNamara was there. And the Russian commander, I think his name was Gibov or something like that. He said that all the missiles were inside Cuba when the blockade went up. All right. The last one got through about 8 hours before the blockade went up. So everything was there. The blockade didn't have anything to do strategically, with what our decisions were going to be, and by the way, I don't know if you know this, this was a very formidable force. You had something like 125 medium and long range missiles. And the guy there on the transcript said it was about 1,200 miles for the mediums, 2,400 for the long range ones,
which could cover the entire United States and reach into Canada,
except northwest. They couldn't hit Seattle, but everything else, that was in play. But in addition to that, they had sent in 7 nuclear submarines capable of launching an atomic weapon. And on top of that, they're IL-28 bombers, which could. So in other words, what you had here in this, when people talk about atomic weapons, they always call this the triad, the missiles, the bombers, and all stages of the triad were in Cuba. So this was, when you add it all up, they had moved in what was essentially a first strike, into Cuba, And so this is another thing that was very, very puzzling as to, why the Russians had done this, and Kennedy, if you listen to the tapes,
he does sound stunned, really.
Yes. Yeah.
On those first couple of days.
Yeah. He thinks it's because of Berlin. Okay. He thinks that what Khrushchev is going to do is he's going to try and put this up as a surprise for us and say, we'll get out of Cuba if you get out of West Berlin. Okay. But see, Khrushchev really misjudged Kennedy on this one. Because like I said earlier, Kennedy was not getting out of West Berlin. Okay.
No.
All right.
That was not negotiable.
So that takes us up to the first 2 or 3 days of the crisis.
Let's listen to a little bit more. What do you say, guys? I think that's still up.
Yeah, there you go.
All right, let's roll some more. Pick it up on the 19th.
This blockade and political action I see leading into war. It'll be right into war. This is almost as bad as the achievement of duty. I just don't see any other solution except direct military intervention right now.
I mean, they can't let us just take out, after all their statements, take out their missiles, kill a lot of Russians, and not do anything.
From a military point of view, I feel that the lowest risk course of action is the full gamut of military action by us. That's it. I think that a blockade and political talk would be considered by a lot of our friends and neutrals as being a pretty weak response to this. And I'm sure a lot of our own citizens would feel that way too. In other words, you're in a pretty bad fix at the present time. You're in a pretty bad fix. I mean, you're in a you take out the missiles, I think you've got to take out their air along with it, and their radar and communications, the whole works. It doesn't make any sense to do anything but that.
The problem is not really just a war against Cuba, but the problem is part of this worldwide struggle with the communists, particularly over Berlin. When you talk about the number of ICBMs they have, they put them on cities, and I think you can see 80 million, whether it's 80 or 100, you're talking about the destruction of the country. So let me ask you, if we go ahead with this airstrike, either on the missiles or on the missiles in the plane, when should that be ready?
We can be ready for attack at dawn on the 21st. I think the earliest possible day is off, maybe even Tuesday morning.
congressional leaders, unaware of the nature of the crisis, were hurried to Washington in Air Force jets.
Mr. President, I understand that you have decided will announce tonight the blockade. Yes, sir. Mr. President, I could not speak out under these circumstances and live with myself. I think that our responsibility is out to demand strong steps in that if you deal with this bill that you have warned these people time and again what happened that there was eventually capability created in Cuba. They can't say they're not on notice. It seems to me it was crossroads. We either push that power or we're not. But we can't invade Cuba. It takes us some while to assemble our force to invade Cuba. How long? I'm right. Protecting Americans. To carry out an invasion would require use of about 250,000 U.S. military personnel. It's quite clear that that invasion must be preceded by substantial air attack. It will take at least 7 days to carry out the airstrike. 2,000 bombing sorties directly against the locations occupied by 8,000 Soviet military personnel. I think it's quite remarkable that we can consider an invasion with 7 days preparation. No invasion of this size ever been prepared with no more than a 7-day lead time. If we go into Cuba, we have to all realize that we are taking the chance that these missiles which are ready to fire won't be fired. If we attempt to strike them from the air, then we will try to get them all because they're mobile. So that's the gamble we can take. And I think that is one hell of a gamble. Many people are prepared to take it. And we finally decide whether we're going to do it, and everybody in this room may be here with us, if we all want to decide to do together. Rocket favor on the basis of this information with an invasion. And all out on it as quickly. I mean, it's just between us and Cuba. I think it's not the worst of the alternatives because you confronted with the Russians. You are actually confronting Russia. And then you fire the first shot. You have the prospect of the Soviet Union as a reprisal to grab Berlin in the morning, which they could do within a couple of hours. So, you may have the war by the next 24 hours.
That's chilling, isn't it? My goodness.
I'm really glad you got to those. The congressional meeting, in retrospect, is really something because as you played there, the two Southern guys, Fulbright and Russell, who were so against going into Vietnam. Russell told Johnson, if you do this, it'll be the worst thing that ever happened to his country. You're sending millions and millions down a rat hole. Okay. And then Fulbright, of course, is the guy who called the hearings after Johnson, had passed the Tonkin Gulf resolution. Starts saying day after day, he's hammering Johnson because he's accusing. Well, these two guys, and you heard it, are all for going into Cuba.
Interesting.
Isn't that really something?
It is. And I wanted to talk with you a little bit about Senator Richard Russell, who we hear there on the tape, saying we've got to do more. We've got to show him how tough we are. He was a close friend, very close friend of Vice President Lyndon Johnson. They had dinner together every Wednesday night, I think, for decades. And LBJ would, of course, later appoint Richard Russell to the Warren Commission. And we'll talk about that a little bit as well. So he was put in charge of investigating John F. Kennedy's murder. Would you tell our viewers a little bit, Jim, about Senator Russell and why he's there in these XCOM meetings?
Because Kennedy, at this moment, which I think is about 5 or 6 days into the crisis, wanted to get as many people behind him as he could and inform the congressional leaders. Okay, Russell, I think, was in charge of the military in the Senate. He was on the committee of
Senate Intelligence Committee, wasn't it?
no, I think before that, it was something called defense or something like that.
Right.
Okay. But Russell
basically he held the purse strings for the Pentagon. Yeah.
Yes. Fulbright was in charge of the Foreign Relations Committee. All right. And so that's why he wanted them there, because he wanted to make sure that these guys were fully informed, okay, and of what the information was and what the decisions were going to be. But let me tell you something else about this meeting. Kennedy was very surprised at what Fulbright and Russell had said, okay? And then after the meeting, and this is in that book, the Kennedy tapes, he's sitting there with his brother because he's so stunned, you know, because Russell and Fulbright were Democrats.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
now
so
he's feuding with his own party.
Right. And
Yeah.
so his brother's trying to console him. Okay. And you know what his brother said? This is something that is so memorable. He goes, Jack, I really think if you wouldn't have called for the blockade, they would have impeached you.
Yeah.
And he was serious when he said that.
Yeah. And I think they would have. You know, and it's the Cold War, so you cannot appear soft on communism.
Right, exactly.
In the Democratic Party.
This
or
is
the Republican
1962.
Party. Yeah,
This
they
is
could have impeached him, and it would have been bipartisan across the board.
Right.
You know,
And so Kennedy's really stunned by this. Okay. So now he's looking for a way out. Okay. He's looking for a way out. And thank God something happens that does give him a way out, you know. But really, and you're exactly right. This moment, these 2 weeks in October 1962, where the world was essentially on the verge of Armageddon, you know, like it's like never happened before, or no matter what Biden says, not even now. Okay.
and you know, when we listen to these tapes, Jim, it's shocking to realize that nearly everybody on this XCOM is against President Kennedy. The majority want a full-scale invasion of Cuba.
Right.
They want all-out war. So talk to me a little bit about the debate between Kennedy and his advisors on the idea of a blockade versus, you know, the rest of his advisors who want to start World War III at this point.
Well, you heard the LeMay thing and Anderson with the Joint Chiefs of Staff. They called it, this is political. You know, the blockade is political, you know, and it's only going to lead to, you know, a Munich type surrender, you know, and we all know that this is when Neville Chamberlain essentially agreed with Hitler to take over the western part of Czechoslovakia after Hitler said he had no designs on the rest of Czechoslovakia.
And that was the end of him as prime minister.
Right,
It ended his
right.
political career.
And so this is just a terrible thing to say. I mean, can you imagine you're working for this guy? You're there at his discretion, and you say something like this, you know? And then Kennedy says, you heard it carefully. He says, well, I hate to tell you this, but you're down there with me. Okay.
That's right.
That this is good. And so they want the Joint Chiefs, of course, they want a full out invasion. They want to go. I think the discrepancy in the number is how many men Kennedy had there versus
how many they wanted.
How many McNamara said you would need
Yeah.
in order to actually invade Cuba successfully. Okay, but we'll get to why that would have been a disaster later. All right.
Yeah.
All right. So Kennedy, you know, he walks out of this meeting and he tells Sorensen something like, he shakes his head. He says, they want a war. You know, they really want a war, you know? And then he says something later is, well, one thing about those guys, if we agreed with them, nobody would be there to tell them they were wrong after.
I think he was so disgusted at one point in these XCOM meetings. I don't remember exactly when, but he confided to someone. He just shook his head and he said, and they call us the human race.
Yes.
Yeah.
Something like that. Yeah. And so Kennedy is seeing slowly but surely that, you know, the floor underneath him is being chopped over. But, you know, he looks at the Joint Chiefs. No, they want to go to war. You know, Russell and Fulbright. No, they want to go to war. And then when Lyndon Johnson gets in there, Oh my God. Okay.
Yeah,
I
his
think
own vice president doesn't
yeah,
agree with him on
you
this.
know, and so this gets, you know, very narrow, a narrow plank that Kennedy's, you know, and so he has to and this is really what's so ironic about this. He at this point has to really rely on the Russians to throw him a bone. Okay. Because, you know, he's getting boxed in by both his military advisors and the XCOM.
And he can't even rely on his own Secretary of State.
Right.
So
right.
that's where Bobby comes in. I mean,
Yes.
I would
yes, and
argue that Bobby Kennedy was kind of the de facto Secretary of State, especially during
Right.
this crisis. You know, he's the liaison directly between Kennedy and Khrushchev, and they kind of cut the Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, out.
And
which
then
is
let
good.
me add this. Once Johnson comes in with this hard-nosed Cold War attitude, that turns McNamara around.
Yep.
And it was McNamara who actually suggested the blockade in the first place.
Right. That's
You know,
right.
but Johnson, you know, Johnson comes in and he says, "Oh my God, you know, look, you're going to give him these Turkish missiles. What else are you going to give him next? You're going to roll up 30 years of Cold War policy, okay? And until we have nothing." And this is really kind of stunning, you know, because this is Johnson knows what Kennedy wants to do. And Johnson comes in and he basically says, you know, this is essentially giving the game away to the Russians. You know, what else do you want us to give them? You know, and so that was really when I read that, I was really kind of shocked at this. Okay, that this is supposed to be his vice president, and he's essentially digging a hole deeper after the Joint Chiefs and Russell and Fulbright already dug in about 3 feet. Okay, so
and they were his allies. I mean,
Yes.
you know, he and Senator Russell talked
Mm.
about it
Mm.
quite a bit at those Wednesday night dinners they had. So
Now, let me tell you about Fulbright. The reason this is so shocking about Fulbright is because at the Bay of Pigs, he was the only one in the room who said no. It was
That's
like
right.
21. It was like 21-1, the vote. It's in McNamara's book in retrospect. You know, it was like 21-1. He was the only guy who said it was a stupid thing to do. Okay, but here, when Kennedy needs him, okay, he's essentially saying that this is the wrong thing to do. You know, and so this is really, if you think about this, this is really a kind of huge drama that is building, you know, towards who's going to go ahead and give a little bit so we can get a negotiated peace out of it.
Right. And on this day, exactly 60 years ago tonight, right?
Is
about
it
this
really?
time,
Oh
yeah.
my God, you're right.
this was the day that the American people and the entire world learned what was going on, because it's important to point out, we think now of the Cuban Missile Crisis as the 13 days because it went on for 13 days, but for the first 7 days, the public, both in the United States and Russia, was completely unaware. They hadn't been told anything about the grave danger that they were in. And so President Kennedy decided, once again, against the advice of most of his XCOM members, to make a televised address and to tell Americans the danger they were in, what was going on in Cuba. And by doing so, of course, he was informing the entire world, because this is something that would affect the entire world. If nuclear weapons start going off, it's not just going to be America and Russia that are affected. Okay. So he was issuing a warning and was trying to be transparent about it. It took him a few days to get around to making that important decision to tell the world. It's also important to point out that the Russians didn't know either. Of course, the Soviet government they had very strict propaganda and control of the media there. So the Russian people had no idea what was going on in Cuba, or that they were on the brink of nuclear war with the United States.
Now, when you said that this was going to involve much bigger than, the Russians had actually targeted the major cities in Europe, you know, during this attack that the military commander had mapped out, because they were part of NATO. Okay. And he wanted to get them before they turned on him. So that's exactly what was going to happen. There was going to be this Asia, North America, Europe, all involved in this nuclear conflagration. And if you remember, this was so back in those days, TV was not and so people were watching this address in department stores. They would be standing in front of the TV in the department stores to watch this thing. Yeah.
Most Americans didn't have a television.
Right.
You know?
Right. And it sure wasn't in color.
It was black and white and very bad picture quality. So if you're of a certain age, you might remember seeing this 60 years ago tonight. Sitting there with your parents, you know, and you didn't know what the speech was going to be about. But the newspapers that morning said, all Americans turn on your TV set tonight at 7:00. The president has a matter of highest national urgency that he wants to talk to you about. So, of course, everybody was gathered around watching the three networks, and this is what they saw.
On October 22nd, 1962, President John F. Kennedy broadcast a special message to the nation from his office in the White House. Here is President Kennedy as he delivered that message bearing on recent events in Cuba.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. Upon receiving the first preliminary hard information of this nature, last Tuesday morning at 9 a.m., I directed that our surveillance be stepped up. And having now confirmed and completed our evaluation of the evidence and our decision on a course of action, this government feels obliged to report this new crisis to you in fullest detail. The characteristic of these new missile sites indicate two distinct types of installations. Several of them include medium-range ballistic missiles capable of carrying a nuclear warhead for a distance of more than 1,000 nautical miles. Each of these missiles, in short, is capable of striking Washington, D.C., the Panama Canal, Cape Canaveral, Mexico City, or any other city in the southeastern part of the United States, in Central America, or in the Caribbean area. Additional sites not yet completed appear to be designed for intermediate range ballistic missiles capable of traveling more than twice as far and thus capable of striking most of the major cities in the Western Hemisphere, ranging as far north as Hudson's Bay, Canada, and as far south as Lima, Peru. In addition, jet bombers capable of carrying nuclear weapons are now being uncrated and assembled in Cuba, while the necessary air bases are being prepared. This urgent transformation of Cuba into an important strategic base by the presence of these large, long-range, and clearly offensive weapons of sudden mass destruction constitutes an explicit threat to the peace and security of all the Americas.
So it's a long speech. It's about 20 minutes. So I'm not going to share the whole thing. Just kind of wanted to give you a feel for what he said. And Jim, tell us what he didn't say. What was he not telling the people at that point?
Well, what was going on at the XCOM was a very serious discussion about what are we going to do if they try and hit a U-2? Because that's how Kennedy's getting this intelligence, okay, is the U-2 flights over Cuba. And by the way, when Khrushchev heard this speech, he was furious at the commander on the island. He was yelling at him, "Why didn't you camouflage your sights?" Okay, that's what you should have done. So then they couldn't have picked it up on their U-2s. Okay.
Oh.
And that was, in the retrospect, that was really a dumb thing not to do, is not to camouflage the sights.
Yeah.
All right.
They're pretty exposed.
Yeah. You just throw a camouflage net over and they can work under it. Okay. And so Khrushchev is really furious about this because he's now at a disadvantage. He thought he had the advantage before, a surprise, but that's not the case anymore. So Kennedy, they're trying to figure out, okay, if they try and knock down a U-2, or if they run the blockade, what are we going to do in retaliation? And Paul Nitze was there, who's really a Republican disguised as a Democrat. Okay, and he's very much the Cold Warrior. And he says, words of the effect, let's start attacking their SAMs, their surface-to-air missiles. Okay, if they shoot down a U-2 flight. And by the way, I don't think we're there yet, but this is what happened. They did shoot down a U-2. Okay, well,
we're getting ahead of ourselves.
Yeah, we're getting a little ahead. That's a little preview.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. And then it was, what if they try and run the blockade? All right. And so the plan there was to fire a cannon over the bow of the ship. Okay. All right. And so that they would get the message, the next one's coming right at you. All right. Okay. So now as this is going on, as these retaliatory messages are being discussed, okay, as time goes on and there's no resolution, like I said earlier, the longer it goes on, the worse it is for Kennedy. All right. And also, I should say, it's also worse for Khrushchev, especially after this speech is made, because now some people in the Kremlin, like Brezhnev, okay, are beginning to think this guy didn't have any plan if these things were discovered. Okay. He was so sure that this was going to work that there's no fallback position. It's either we go ahead and unleash them or we get out of there and we retreat. Okay. And so this is what begins to happen in the Kremlin, is that a lot of the upper level guys in the Secretariat begin to question Khrushchev's judgment. Okay. And by the way, I should say this. Castro asked the same question.
Yes.
He said, what are you going to do if they discover the missiles are there and you're not done with them? And Khrushchev kind of brushed it off as saying, oh, we can always send the Russian fleet into the Caribbean, which is pretty crazy when you think about it.
Yeah.
Okay. Like it wasn't going to be intercepted, And
so not only did this undermine, and this would eventually lead to Khrushchev's downfall, and we'll talk about that later.
Exactly right.
And it undermined him with his own party and his cabinet and the people of the USSR. When word reached them of Kennedy's speech, they're like, wait, nobody told us.
Yes.
Aren't you? Yeah. Why didn't you tell us, for crying out loud?
And this is why I believe, if you saw the film JFK Revisited, one of the things we closed with was Khrushchev at the American embassy blinking back tears. Okay. I don't think that was just for Kennedy. I think that he also realized it was pretty soon it's going to be all over for him. Yeah, it's going to be all over for him too.
He's toast. And it all started here. The downfall of both of these men started right here. And
yes, that's what a lot of people believe. Yeah.
I do. Let's pick it up here. We're going to go back to the White House tapes. This is right after Kennedy's speech. So this would be the 23rd of October, I believe.
will be approaching the Bay Area, by which I mean an arc about 500 miles from Cuba, or approximately noon today. Both of these ships are good targets for our first intercept. Admiral Anderson plans to fight away from one or both of them today. There is a submarine very close, we believe, to each of them, and hence it's a very dangerous situation. Mr. President, I have an offer of candidate. Just received information that all suspected civilian ships currently identified in Cuban waters have either stopped or returned. How do we find out whether they're talking about the ships in Cuba or one coming off? Given this exact situation, we have depth charges that have such a small charge that we drop and they can actually hit the submarine without damaging the submarine. We propose to use those as warning depth charges. The attic with anti-submarine helicopters will be in the vicinity, and those helicopters will attempt to divert the submarine from the intercept point. The range of our sonar and according to the range of this torpedo and the inaccuracy, well, no, that is submarine warfare and such that I don't have any great confidence that we can push him away from our ship and make the intercept securely. But this is only a plan, and there's many uncertainties. Okay, let's see. Three ships are definitely turning back. One is a full tower we most interested in. Certain others are showing indications that they're making it back. Admiral Anderson makes every effort now to get planes out of the area. You need want to give that chance to get around. You want to have word going out from our trucking around our ship. Well, I was thinking you have to touch with the ethics to tell them, wait an hour and see whether that ship is going to score and deal with other intelligence.
So you see how careful President Kennedy is being.
Yes, like I said, they were trying to dream up how they would retaliate if somebody would cross the quarantine line. Okay, and I have to give McNamara a lot of credit because he's the one who's really being honest, and saying, this might be a secure operation. If we have to like drop a depth charge or something like that, we're going in with a smaller version of the depth charge. Okay, we're just trying to avoid destroying the submarine. All right, and if we have to do something from the air, that is not the most accurate way, for an interception to occur. So, this is, I believe, if you follow McNamara through this crisis plus Vietnam, he was actually a pretty good, servant to JFK. He was always
He really was.
He was trying to be honest with them.
Yeah.
Okay. And then hopefully when we talk about Vietnam later, we can talk about how McNamara really carried out what Kennedy's policy, what he was trying to do there. So I believe he, until the very end, when he turns a little bit, I think he was actually a pretty good, well, let's put it this way. Him and George Ball were probably the best of the worst, excluding Robert Kennedy, of course.
Yeah. I agree with that. I grew up, of course, thinking that McNamara was the devil.
Right.
Like a lot of kids who remember the Vietnam War. All the hippies hated him and he was the guy responsible for ramping up the war.
Right.
And I guess you could say he was a good yes man. He used to be president of Ford Motor Company. So he was a corporate guy. And he was kind of a yes man to Kennedy, like you said, a good servant. and
Yeah.
he served Kennedy well. And then when Johnson became president, he had no choice really but
Yeah,
to
I hope we
serve as
talk about.
president.
I hope we talk about that later because it's a very interesting
It is.
episode. Okay,
Yeah, it
what
is.
happened? What happened to poor Robert McNamara after
Hmm.
Kennedy was assassinated?
He had a nervous breakdown
Yes.
during the Vietnam War. He had
Yeah,
to resign
that's one of
because
the things
his
I really
mental
want to.
health was
One of the things I really
wrecked.
want to talk about. His
Yeah.
son had the flag of North Vietnam in his bedroom.
What?
Yeah, McNamara's
No.
son. Yeah, he had the flag of North Vietnam in his bedroom.
I never knew that.
Yeah.
Wow.
That's what it did to his family, you know?
Jeez. That is fascinating, Jim. I
Mm.
never ever knew that.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to talk a little bit while we're at it. I was going to ask Rick, but I think he stepped out for a moment. I wanted to talk a little bit about the level of secrecy around all of this, what the people could be told, what they couldn't be told. Now we have the benefit of hindsight and we get to listen to the tapes and find out what was really going on. But what the people were being told was a whole nother story. I want to play you a little bit of the CBS Evening News during the missile crisis. This was October 24th. And this is what good old Uncle Walter Cronkite was telling you of what was going on.
Let's check over at the Pentagon with Charles von Fremd on that. Chuck, is there any late information about the position of those Soviet ships or what might be happening to them?
Walter, we haven't heard a word for several hours now as to when the confrontation between U.S. Vessels and the Soviet ships will come about. This just points up again that we're only a little way along the first step of this great undertaking which the President launched us on Monday. The people here in the Pentagon are quite tense. As you know, the military is subordinate, of course, to civilian direction, and the feeling here is that we have a long way to go before we're out of the woods. The people here at the Pentagon look particularly toward point 6 of the President's 7 points that he made on Monday night, which calls for the breaking down and withdrawal of all offensive weapons before this quarantine can be ended. The all offensive weapons at the Pentagon also includes those light jet bombers which the Soviets have shipped, as well as the much more publicized missiles and the missile pads. Also here at the Pentagon today, we went back on a wartime security guidance system for the first time since the Korean War, a 12-point program in which all civilian and military personnel working for the Department of Defense have their lips sealed. From now on, we're under what amounts to virtual censorship here at the Pentagon, which points up again the severity with which the situation is viewed here.
Walter?
Yes?
Can I come in on what Von Fremd has said and what the White House has said? It's very clear from everything that we're told down here that we will not make any kind of a deal or any kind of a negotiation unless we have an absolute guarantee that the agreement will be carried out. And that would mean what Mr. Stevenson suggested at the UN yesterday, that at the very minimum we will demand a UN observer team in Cuba to make sure those bases are being dismantled. Now, Castro has said he wouldn't permit it. If that's the case, then the President's answer to Utah, the final answer, will certainly be no.
Do you think there's any possibility, and we might address this to Dick Hoddlett, that Castro might accept a neutral observer, as has been suggested Brazil might offer to be, rather than an official UN observer? Is it that he would not accept any observation on his home territory?
The first indications, Walter, are that the objection is to any foreigner coming in and in some way impinging on the sovereign rights of Cuba by going and looking around under some foreign authority. And here again, the American sources here draw the parallel between the whole nuclear testing issue, which again has foundered not on the nature of the neutral inspection, which is designed to rule out cheating and violation of a given word, but on the fact itself. The Russians don't object to a non-neutral team as against a neutral team. They object to any team, and the indications are that the Cubans will hold the same position in this regard.
Gentlemen, you've each made the point on the relative value of Berlin and Cuba in this crisis, but I'd like to ask the question from the layman's standpoint. It seems to the observer of the scene that that Cuba has to be the point of the crisis. This is the point at which we are concerned that there might be shooting among the ships at sea, that in the story that we heard a great deal of today, the possibility that invasion might have to be undertaken to assure that those bases are eliminated. If invasion is undertaken, the Russians have said that they would retaliate with rocket fire. We have said if there's rocket fire from Cuba, we will retaliate, and there goes the whole ball game. So how do we relate Berlin as the major crisis when the shooting war could start tomorrow over Cuba?
Wow. Shooting war could start tomorrow over Cuba. Don't panic. I'm glad you came back, Rick, because I wanted to bring you into this. You've been a newsman for some 30 years. You've been an anchor. I wanted to get your opinion on what we just saw there. Do you think that the media at that time was overhyping the story, or was Walter trying to keep the public somewhat calm and not induce a mass panic? Well, what are your thoughts?
Well, I'm actually more interested in what Jim would say about that. In fact, that was going to be my question to you, Jim. And really my question is, like the Vietnam War, television, the Vietnam War was really the first war that was viewed in people's living rooms on television.
Right. That's what it was called, the living room war.
Right. And so this is also something I think that is being influenced by media coverage. How do you think that played into it? And then the other question that I have, two-part question. Why aren't people right now more engaged? We're hearing about the possibility of nuclear Armageddon from both Putin and Biden. And it seems to me we're as close as, or maybe closer to it than we were even then. And yet people don't seem to be as engaged. What are your views?
To answer the second question, that is a very interesting query, because I believe, if anything, that's been underplayed. It really has. I mean, you've got this nuclear reactor right in the middle of these feuding armies, and you have Putin very, very worried about the kinds of weapons that are really like 100 miles away, which is what it was here with the Cuban Missile Crisis, So I'm really puzzled as to why it's not more on the front burner, why it's only a back burner issue. I don't think it should be, But see, one of the things that's happened, I believe, in this whole Ukraine crisis is that the MSM, which I didn't know Rick is a former member of, okay, that
used to be on the enemy team,
is that the MSM has thrown such a blanket over this, that it's pretty much all pervasive. They've set the agenda as to what they want you to talk about and what you can't talk about.
All they want to talk about is the midterms, and
yeah. And in this case, it's all essentially, we're supposed to blame the whole thing on Russia and make out Putin to be, the arch villain of it, and so there's very little room when you do it that way. There's very little room for negotiation, right. As to what they're talking about. This was very real, what these commentators are talking about, because I don't know if you want me to reveal this now, or do you want me to reveal it later about the Luna missiles?
Yeah,
you know what I'm
go
talking
ahead.
about? Okay.
Sure.
The Russians had tactical nukes in Cuba, two varieties: cruise missiles, the forerunner to the cruise missile, which had a range of 90 miles, and the Luna missiles, which had a range of 25 miles. Okay. So when McNamara heard about this later on, he was so shocked he tore off his headphones. It was at a conference down in Havana. So in other words, what that meant was that any invasion by the United States, I don't care how many men you had, in 100,000, 150,000, would have been incinerated by these short-range tactical nuclear weapons. So what these guys are talking about is very real at that time. if the shooting war breaks out, how fast will it take, to become like all consuming, So this
seconds, minutes.
Well, it doesn't take very long to launch a missile 90 miles. Once the invasion force started coming in, off of Florida, and so this was a very, very real option. Which, and by the way, I should mention this. There's long been a debate about whether or not McNamara and the CIA had informed Kennedy about these short-range atomic weapons. Okay, there's two camps. Some say they did, some say they didn't. I believe McNamara's reaction in 92 would be pretty much to say that he wasn't fully informed about these tactical nuclear weapons. He was really kind of shocked. But
that was news to him.
He started waving his arms in disbelief. He couldn't believe what he was hearing, So this really, by not going for the invasion route, in a very real sense, Kennedy really did save us from Armageddon, because once those atomic weapons, those short range, I don't think there's any turning back after those short range atomic weapons went off. I think what would have happened next is that the Russians would have launched the rest of their missiles. Okay. The United States would have sent in a strike against Cuba, and then the Russians would have blasted those European cities. Okay. And then it was pretty much all over, because the United States would have launched a first strike against Russia.
Just like Walter Cronkite said there, he said, that's the ball game, folks.
Right. And he I don't think he was exaggerating very much.
I honestly don't. I thought he handled that pretty responsibly. I mean, how do you report to the world that we're on the brink of nuclear war and not cause a mass panic? I mean, everybody's going to panic. And maybe that's just my theory. Maybe that's why the mainstream media is downplaying the current situation that we're in, because they don't want people to panic. Mm-hmm. But if you're going to panic, this might be a good time to panic.
Well, I think the mainstream media is playing it down because they're cheerleading for the war.
Yes, they're cheerleading for a nuclear war.
Yeah.
What? What? Hold on a minute. Let's go back to the missile crisis tapes, because now we're getting to the head. This is all coming to a head on the weekend of the 25th and 26th, 27th. This is where it's all hell's fixing to break loose. So hang on to your hats, folks.
We would recommend 2 daylight surveillance missions today. Same targets. Missiles. You want to do it, things all right. Premier Khrushchev told President Kennedy necessary to draw offensive effort from Cuba necessary to launch rockets from Turkey. That wasn't in the letter we received, was it? No. I read it pretty carefully. There's one deal in the letter, now we've got a different deal. How can we negotiate with somebody who changes the deal before we get a chance to reply and announce it publicly the deal before we receive it? I think we have to assume that this is their new and latest position, and it's public one. He's put this out in a way to cause maximum attention and embarrassment. The Turks are bound to say they won't agree to this. The Turks feel very strongly about this. They feel that it's a matter of prestige and a matter of real. I mean, this would be an extremely unsettling. And this is unsettling now, George. He's got us in a pretty good spot here. Most people will regard this as not an unreasonable proposal. Most people think this is a rather good trade or take advantage of it. Very well today, Cuba with all its glory it's going to be, and we could have got them out by making a deal on the same level as Turkey. Khrushchev took it out, and then the Turks said they won't accept it. Then what we do is Cuba seems to be a separate groundwork to do something to Turkey. And the ships are still moving. We cannot commit ourselves to being impaled on a long negotiating book while the work was on these bases. We've got to make the key of this letter the cessation of war. That we're all in agreement on. There's no question about that.
first ingredient that they emphasize for any solution is the cessation of the work and the inoperability of the missiles under reasonable standards. Otherwise, time is way on. The U-2 was shot down. The
Say
pilot
what?
shot down. Pilot shot down. Pilot killed. The pilot's body is in flux. Well, this is much an escalation by them, isn't it?
That's an oh shit moment.
I know what how can we send a U-2 fellow over there tomorrow unless we take out all of them? They fired the first shot.
They fired the first shot. Shit just got real.
Yeah. As I said, that was Nitzy.
Yeah.
Okay. Again, this is really interesting stuff because Khrushchev has sent over the bone that Kennedy is really looking forward to, except he sent
Funny way
two.
of doing it by shooting down your U-2.
No, look, I'll get to how that happened. Okay. Except he kind of took back the first offer and amended it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. The first offer that he sent was a pledge from Kennedy that the United States would not invade Cuba. That was what he wanted. And Kennedy was willing to do that. That's fine. Okay. Because he didn't have any plans on invading Cuba.
And he didn't want that war any more than Fidel
Right.
or Nikki did.
Right.
Mhm.
But then about 20 hours later, Khrushchev sends another letter, and this one he publicizes, in which he says he wants the Jupiter missiles taken out of Turkey also. Now, it's really kind of odd about this because Kennedy, if you read the whole transcript, he says, I thought we had those missiles taken out of Turkey.
Right.
Okay. And he says, and McNamara says, no, they're still there. Okay. And Kennedy goes, what? So now he has to negotiate both of these things, instead of just one of them. One was pretty simple. But now, and the fact that Khrushchev has made this public puts all the pressure on him as a delicate way of finding his way out of this thing. He really doesn't want to give in on the Turkey missiles in public. Okay. He doesn't mind doing it, as we'll see. He doesn't mind doing it privately. And by the way, I should say why he doesn't mind, because the Jupiter missiles were supposed to be replaced by Polaris submarine missiles, which were better than the Jupiters. Okay.
Yeah, the Jupiters were basically obsolete.
Yes, right.
Yeah. It was old technology, and
yes,
yeah, we didn't need them anyway.
So what happens then is that this terrible news about the U-2 being shot down. Now, how does this? Khrushchev was very upset when he heard this. He was as upset as Kennedy was. Okay. And he says, how the hell did that happen? Okay. When I'm negotiating, we're on the verge of the end of the world, and you do so. Castro had taken over the SAM site, and it's him who ordered the U-2 shot down.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. And so that very moment is a huge turning point in what, not just the crisis, but going into 1963. Because at this point, when Castro did that, Khrushchev said, I can't trust this guy. I cannot trust this guy. And so what happens is that Khrushchev is now going to cut out Castro on the final negotiations to get out of this horrible trap that both sides are caught in. And almost accidentally, what's going to happen is that this separation between Castro and Khrushchev is going to open the back door for a Kennedy-Castro rapprochement, which we'll get to later.
Excellent.
Something, if you were a playwright, you could not have written anything
really,
more gripping.
Truly. And to me, this is that moment when I think it dawns on both Kennedy and Khrushchev that this could very easily slip out of their control.
Yes.
that they are no longer the ones who could pull us back from the brink. They're not even sure themselves if they can do it, if they can control their generals, if Nikita can control Fidel down there in Cuba, because Fidel's mad as hell too.